In 1941, a single American company produced more steel in 1 year than the entire nation of Nazi Germany. They built the Golden Gate Bridge, the Empire State Building, the warships that won World War II. At their peak, they employed 300,000 people and operated on 6 continents. Charles M. Schwab built this empire from a single Pennsylvania mill into the second largest steel producer on Earth. But by 2001, it was gone. Bankrupt. The mills torn down for scrap. This is the story of Bethlehem Steel, the company that built America, and then watched America move on without it. The story begins in 1857, in a small Pennsylvania town along the Lehigh River. A group of investors formed the Bethlehem Iron Company, initially focused on manufacturing railroad rails. The location was strategic. Coal from nearby mines, iron ore from New Jersey, the Lehigh River for transportation and power. But for decades, it remained a modest operation. Just another iron mill among hundreds across the industrial Northeast. That changed in 1899 when a 37-year-old steel executive named Charles M. Schwab took control. Schwab was already a legend in the industry. He'd started as a $1-a-day stake driver and worked his way up to become president of Carnegie Steel, Andrew Carnegie's massive Pittsburgh operation. But Schwab had bigger ambitions. He wanted to build an empire that could compete with anyone in the world. Under Schwab's leadership, Bethlehem Steel made a critical strategic decision. While other American steel companies focused on rails and structural beams, Schwab looked at what the growing nation really needed: ships, specifically the armor and heavy guns for the United States Navy. In 1904, Bethlehem Steel won its first major naval contract. They would forge the massive gun barrels and armor plating for America's new battleship fleet. This required technology that barely existed in America. Schwab invested millions in new open hearth furnaces and hydraulic forging. Presses, equipment so large it had to be custom built. The gamble paid off. By 1910, Bethlehem Steel was the primary supplier of armor plate and ordnance to the U.S. Navy. But this was just the beginning. An event was coming that would transform Bethlehem Steel from a regional player into an industrial titan. World War I was about to begin, and America's allies desperately needed steel. When war erupted across Europe in 1914, America remained neutral. But Britain and France immediately looked across the Atlantic for steel, weapons, and ships. And they turned to Bethlehem. Between 1914 and 1917, before America officially entered the war, Bethlehem Steel signed contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars with the Allied powers. The company built submarines for Britain, artillery shells by the millions, armor plate for French tanks. Every hour, around the clock, the furnaces of Bethlehem roared. Charles Schwab expanded rapidly. He bought shipyards in San Francisco, opened new mills in Pennsylvania, acquired iron ore mines in Cuba. The workforce exploded. By 1916, Bethlehem Steel employed over 50,000 workers in the Bethlehem plant alone. These weren't just jobs. These were careers that built communities. Workers could afford homes. Their children went to good schools. Bethlehem, Pennsylvania transformed from a small industrial town into a thriving city. Then, in April 1917, America entered the war. The demand became overwhelming. The U.S. government needed ships. Lots of them, fast. Bethlehem Steel built 1,127 ships during World War I. Cargo ships, troop transports, destroyers, battleships. At peak production, they were launching a new vessel every few weeks. The steel mills ran at capacity that seemed impossible. 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The night sky over Bethlehem glowed orange from the blast furnaces. Workers endured brutal conditions. The heat near the furnaces could reach 120 degrees. Molten steel accidents killed or maimed dozens every year. But the wages were the best in Pennsylvania, and there was no shortage of men willing to take the risk. Charles Schwab became one of the wealthiest men in America. His personal fortune grew to over $200 million. But more importantly, Bethlehem Steel had proven something crucial. American heavy industry could outproduce anyone in the world when it mattered. When the armistice was signed on November 11, 1918, Bethlehem Steel had become America's second largest steel producer, behind only U.S. Steel. The question was, what would happen when the war contracts ended? The answer would define the next 2 decades. As it turned out, America had another use for all that steel. It wanted to build upward. The 1920s saw an explosion of skyscraper construction across America, and nearly all of them were built with Bethlehem Steel. The Chrysler Building, 1,046 feet tall. Every beam, every rivet, forged in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The George Washington Bridge, spanning the Hudson River. The longest suspension bridge in the world at the time. Bethlehem Steel supplied 28,000 tons of structural steel. Buildings that would define American cities for the next century were being held up by steel from one company. The business model was perfect. America was urbanizing rapidly. Cities needed buildings. Buildings needed steel. And Bethlehem could produce steel cheaper and faster than almost anyone. The company's revenue climbed year after year. Stock prices soared. Dividends flowed to shareholders. But beneath the boom, cracks were forming. The mills were aging. Equipment that had been pushed to maximum capacity during the war was wearing out. Competitors were investing in new technologies like continuous casting and electric arc furnaces. Bethlehem Steel's management, comfortable with their dominant position, chose to focus on dividends rather than reinvestment. It was a decision that wouldn't matter until it did. When the stock market crashed in 1929, construction stopped. Almost overnight, orders for steel plummeted. By 1933, Bethlehem Steel was operating at just 25% capacity. Thousands of workers were laid off. The cities that had grown around the mills, communities entirely dependent on steel, fell into poverty. But Charles Schwab still believed. He kept the mills open, even at a loss, waiting for the recovery. The question was, would it come in time? The recovery came with a vengeance. When Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor, America's industrial capacity became the most important weapon in the arsenal. And Bethlehem Steel was ready. President Roosevelt called on American industry to become the arsenal of democracy. Bethlehem Steel answered that call like no other. Within weeks, the mills were running at capacity again. Within months, they were exceeding every production record ever set. In 1943 alone, Bethlehem Steel produced 9.4 million tons of steel. But raw tonnage wasn't the impressive part. It was what they built with it. Bethlehem's shipyards built 1,121 vessels during World War II. Not over years, over 4 years. That's 28 warships every single month. Destroyers, aircraft carriers, Liberty ships, landing craft. They revolutionized shipbuilding, applying mass production techniques that had never been used for vessels that large. Sections were prefabricated, then assembled like enormous steel puzzles. The scale was almost incomprehensible. At peak employment during the war, Bethlehem Steel had 300,000 workers spread across their facilities. The main Bethlehem plant covered over 1,800 acres. You could fit 1,400 football fields inside it. And unlike World War I, this time women joined the workforce in massive numbers. By 1944, over 15,000 women worked at Bethlehem Steel, doing jobs that had been considered men's work just years before. The company that had nearly gone bankrupt during the Depression was now critical to Allied victory. Every major naval battle in the Pacific involved ships built or armed by Bethlehem Steel. The D-Day invasion was carried out on landing craft from Bethlehem's yards. When Germany surrendered in May 1945 and Japan followed in August, Bethlehem Steel had earned its place in history. They had quite literally built the tools of victory. In 1945, Bethlehem Steel was the second largest steel producer in the world, the largest shipbuilder in the United States, and employed over 300,000 people. Charles Schwab had died in 1939, just before the war began. But the empire he built had reached its absolute zenith. After the war ended, everyone assumed Bethlehem Steel would continue to dominate for generations. They were wrong. What no one understood yet was that the very success of the war years had masked fundamental problems. Problems that would take decades to become visible, but would ultimately prove fatal. The 1950s were boom years for America. Soldiers came home, bought houses, started families. The suburbs exploded. Highways were built. The economy roared. And steel was needed for all of it. Bethlehem Steel remained profitable, strong, and seemingly invincible. But the world was changing in ways that American steelmakers didn't see coming. During the war, Allied bombing had destroyed steel mills across Germany and Japan. After the war, those countries rebuilt from scratch, but they didn't rebuild the old way. They built modern mills with the latest technology, continuous casting, electric arc furnaces, computer controls, automated systems. Meanwhile, Bethlehem Steel was still operating with equipment from the 1920s and 30s, equipment that had been run into the ground during 2 world wars. The company's management faced a choice: invest billions in modernization, or continue to pay dividends to shareholders. They chose dividends, short-term profits over long-term survival. By the 1960s, Japanese and German steel was cheaper, higher quality, and could be delivered faster than American steel. In 1959, steelworkers across America, including at Bethlehem, went on strike for 116 days. They wanted better wages and benefits. The strike was the longest in American history. The union won. Wages increased significantly, but so did costs. And Bethlehem Steel couldn't raise prices because foreign steel was flooding the market. The math became brutal. High labor costs, aging equipment, foreign competition with modern mills and lower wages. In 1977, Bethlehem Steel closed its Bethlehem shipyard. The yard that had built 1,121 warships was shut down permanently. Jobs disappeared, thousands of them, but management insisted the core steel business was still strong. They just needed to weather the storm. Then came the 1980s, and with it, the final blows. Foreign steel imports surged. At the same time, American manufacturing began moving overseas. The industries that had consumed Bethlehem steel, shipbuilding, construction, heavy equipment, were declining or offshoring, and a new material was emerging that required no steel at all. Plastic, polymers, composites. By 1982, Bethlehem Steel posted its first annual loss since the Great Depression. The company tried everything. They closed older mills. They laid off workers. They begged the government for tariffs on foreign steel. But the fundamental problem remained. Bethlehem Steel was operating with 1920s technology in a 1980s world, and they no longer had the capital to modernize. In 1995, Bethlehem Steel closed its flagship plant in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. The heart of the company, the mill that Charles Schwab had built into an empire, over 140 years of history, ended. The equipment was sold for scrap. The building sat empty, but the company itself limped on for a few more years, trying to survive with its remaining facilities. It wouldn't last much longer. On October 15, 2001, Bethlehem Steel filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. The company that had once been valued at billions was worth nothing. Stock became worthless paper. Pension obligations totaling $3.6 billion were dumped on the federal government. Thousands of retirees who had worked 30, 40 years at the mills saw their promised pensions slashed. Healthcare benefits disappeared. In 2003, the company's remaining assets were sold to International Steel Group for $1.5 billion. The Bethlehem Steel name was retired permanently. What was left of the company, the parts worth keeping, was absorbed into competitors. The rest was liquidated. In Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, the massive steel plant that had defined the city for over a century was torn down. Some buildings were preserved as historical landmarks. Most became parking lots and redevelopment sites. The blast furnaces, the rolling mills, the forges that had produced the steel for the Golden Gate Bridge, for battleships, for skyscrapers, were cut into pieces and sold as scrap. The final irony, much of that scrap was shipped to China and melted down to make new steel in modern mills. Bethlehem Steel had built America, and in the end, America recycled it to build somewhere else. But the legacy remains visible everywhere. Drive across the Golden Gate Bridge, walk through the Chrysler Building, visit a museum and see a World War II destroyer. The steel is still there, still strong, still holding up the structures that define American cities. Somewhere on nearly every major structure built in America between 1910 and 1970, there's a stamp that reads, Bethlehem Steel. The company died, but what it built endures. Bethlehem Steel's story is a uniquely American one. The rise, immigrant workers and industrial ambition building something that had never existed before. The peak, saving the world twice through sheer productive capacity. The fall, complacency, short-term thinking, and the inevitable march of global competition. It's easy to look back and see the mistakes, the failure to modernize, the focus on dividends over reinvestment, the inability to adapt when the world changed. But perhaps the real lesson isn't about what Bethlehem Steel did wrong. It's about what they did right for as long as it lasted. For over a century, Bethlehem Steel employed hundreds of thousands of people at wages that built the American middle class. They produced the materials that constructed the modern world. They answered the call when their country needed them most. That legacy doesn't disappear just because the company did. Today, parts of the old Bethlehem mill have been preserved. The blast furnaces stand as monuments, lit up at night, reminding visitors of what once was. Tourists walk where steelworkers once poured molten iron. Concert venues and museums occupy buildings where turbines and generators once roared. The steel is gone, but the story remains. Bethlehem Steel, the mill that built America, and a reminder that even giants are not forever. Bethlehem Steel wasn't the only American industrial giant to rise and fall in the 20th century. If you found this story compelling, you might want to see what happened to other companies that once seemed invincible. The story of Pan Am, the airline that defined luxury travel and then vanished. Or Kodak, the photography giant that invented the digital camera and then was destroyed by it. These stories share a common thread: success, scale, and then the inability to adapt when the world changed. Subscribe to see more stories of American industry, the triumphs, the innovations, and yes, the failures that shape the country we live in today.